Good afternoon, Sir Halcon. Good afternoon, classmates. Today we'll be presenting on why is rent so high. So my team members are Miss Beichong, Miss Calyao, Miss Cornell, Miss Navarro, and of course, yours truly, Mr. Arden Real. Next slide, please. So for our agenda today, we'll be introducing what is rent and the different types of rent, the theories of rent, the Ricardian theory of rent, the modern theory of rent, and of course, an additional theory of rent that is the central business district or the bid rent theory. Next, we will be comparing and contrasting the rental cost of living in urban versus in regional areas. And then we will be looking if mass transportation is actually an incentive for renting outside the metropolitan area. Next, we'll be showing you some government interventions that and programs that the Philippine government actually implemented to combat the the high rent issue in the Philippines. Next, we will be presenting our policy prescriptions or the policy imperatives by the group. Next slide, please. So, an introduction. So, what is rent? Next slide. So, rent, in its simplest terms, rent is the tenant's regular payment to a landlord for the use of property or land. So, if you are a dormer and if you are a dormer from the province and you are willing to go to school to the NCR or Manila, you are going to pay rent for your dorm because you are using the dorm to live there or stay there. Next slide, please. So these are the different types of rent. First, we have economic rent. So economic rent is actually the payment made to a factor of production in excess of the minimum amount necessary to keep the factor in its present occupation. Next we have the gross rent. So this rent actually is what is paid for the services of land and capital invested on it. So this type of rent actually includes the following. So it includes the payment for the use of land, the interest on capital invested on it, and the wages for the services of the landlord for supervising the investment in land. Next, we have contractual rent, a payment made to the landlord by tenants, of course, on the basis of EA or some contract, which may be verbal or written. So it may be more or less than the economic rent. Next, you have the scarcity rent. It actually applies to all the factors of production whose supply is less elastic. So scarcity rent actually rises due to the scarcity of factors of production. Next, we have the differential or the situational rent. Here, it actually refers to the rent that arises due to differences in the fertility of land. So, this type of rent actually arises under extensive cultivation. So, if you are putting more capital on cultivating this piece of land, of course, this type of rent actually rises. So, the surplus enjoyed by more fertile land over the less fertile land is known as a differential rent. And lastly, we have quasi-rent. So according to Marshall, the quasi-rent is actually defined as the surplus earned by man-made factors of production whose supply is inelastic or fixed in the short run, but elastic in the long run. So for example, there is a sudden increase in the demand of houses. But the supply of houses does not increase at that speed because of can we say limited building materials. So the sudden increase in the return from selling of houses is actually termed as quasi-rent. So next slide, please. So here I will be presenting the different theories of rent. So next slide. So various economists have actually proposed different theories for the origin of rent. So prominent theory among these theories of rent is the Ricardian theory of rent, which I will present here, and the modern theory of rent, and actually an additional, the bid rent theory. So the classical theory of rent or the Ricardian theory of rent So the Ricardian theory of rent actually follows the views of classical writers. So about the operation of the law of diminishing returns in agriculture. So classical theories like West, Torrance, Malthus, and Ricardo actually each formulated a different theory of differential rent. So this theory of rent is the form presented by David Ricardo, which has become one of the most popular types of theory of differential rent. So David Ricardo was actually a British economist. So he defined rent as the portion of the produce of the land which is paid to the landlord for the use of the original and indestructible powers of the soil. So the true economic rent is actually a payment for the use of land. So it actually excludes the interest on the land's investment. So next slide, please. So some assumptions of the Ricardian theory of rent. Rent is the return of original and indestructible powers of soil. The supply of land is fixed and the existing quantity is also fixed. So therefore, because it is gifted by nature and cannot be increased or decreased. So since the law of diminishing returns or increasing costs operates in agriculture, therefore the law of diminishing product operates on the productivity of land. So since the land is a gift of nature, production cost is also zero. So land has no alternative use and is only used in cultivation. And different lands have different fertility levels. So utilization of land for cultivation is done based on the order of the fertility of land. So most fertile land is cultivated first before using the next grade land. So this is because the quantity of land is limited and so is its productiveness. And it is not uniform in quality. And if the superior land um, will not support the population, so a recourse must be done to the inferior land. So if the more fertile land is actually not providing much to the population, therefore we should invest. I mean, the Ricardian theory of rent actually says that we should recourse our capital to the more inferior lands, and thus the produce is raised in different costs. So there is also the assumption that there is perfect competition in the market of land and the perfect competition in the product market. So rent is not a part of the cost of production, and so thus this does not determine the price of corn, which is used by Ricardo. So rather, the price of corn actually determines rent. This means that the amount of rent is determined by the degree of the differences in the productivities of land. So next slide, please. So on the basis of these assumptions, Ricardo actually pointed out two reasons on why rent appears. First is that rent appears due to the limited supply of land. This is known as the scarcity rent. So I told you the definition earlier. So for example, if all lands are homogeneous, therefore, but the demand of land exceeds its supply, the entire land will actually earn economic rent by virtue of its scarcity. So since there is a scarcity in land, it actually earns more. And also, the rent appears due to differences in fertility and hence differences in productive capacity of land. This is known as the differential rent. Next slide, please. So some criticisms of the Ricardian theory of rent. There is actually no original and indestructible power of land. I'm so sorry. The supply of land is not limited from the standpoint of the farmer, and that there must exist a production cost if land is considered from the standpoint of an individual farmer instead of from the standpoint of the society. So the assumption that land has no alternative uses other than the production of corn is actually unrealistic. Kasi this is because David Ricardo actually based his theory on the production of corn. So most economists find it unrealistic. So the Ricardian order of cultivation, that is to cultivate the first or the most fertile land first and then move on to the less and less. May not be feasible in all cases. So also, the Ricardian concept of marginal land is not seen in the real world, and that this theory is only applicable in the case of land. But according to modern economists, there is rent, of course, rent component in all factor incomes if the supply is limited. So, and also according to Ricardo, that rent is not included in the price of corn, but it is not always true. Next, we will move on to the modern theory of rent. Next slide, please. So the modern theory of rent is actually an amplified and modified version of the Ricardian theory of rent. So it was first all discussed by J.S. Mills, and after that developed by economists like Jevons, Pareto, Marshall, and Joan Robinson, and other famous economists. So according to the theory of rent, or to the modern theory of rent, economic rent is a surplus that is not peculiar to land alone. So it can be part of income of labor, capital, and of course entrepreneurship. So according to the modern version, actually, rent is a surplus that arises due to the differences in actual earning and transfer earning. So rent is equal to actual earning minus transfer earning. Next slide, please. So what is transfer earning? So in all sectors, we all know that each factor of production has varied uses. So when we transfer one factor from one use to another, we have to sacrifice the income earned by it from its earlier use. So the sacrifice of income is actually called the transfer earning. So this is actually the amount of money that any particular unit could earn its best paid alternative use is sometimes called the transfer earning. So in general, it is the excess of what any unit gets over its transfer earnings is economic rent. Next slide, please. So some major features of the modern theory of rent, that first is rent can be part of income of all factors of production. So the entire income of land is actually called rent because its supply is perfectly inelastic. And next is the amount of rent depends upon the differences between actual earning and transfer earning. And also, lastly, rent arises when the supply of the factor is either perfectly inelastic or less elastic. So on the other hand, no rent rises when the supply, of course, of the factor is perfectly elastic. So next slide please. Why does rent rises according to the modern theory of rent? So according to the modern theory of rent actually rises due to the scarcity of land. So supply of other factors like labor, capital, and others can also be scarce in relation to demand. So therefore, the income earned by these factors in excess of their minimum income is called economic rent. The factors of production are divided into two parts. So specific and non-specific. So specific factors are the factors these factors refer to the factors which have only one use. So for example, a farm used for growing wheat alone. Such factors have no mobility, so specific use. Next is non-specific factors. So these factors are those which have mobility and can be put in different uses. So it is only due to the reason that specific factors cannot be put to other uses. So complementing sila. So specificity of factors is the main cause of the emergence of rent. So it is so because specific factors cannot be put to any other use. Therefore, merong rent na papasok if there is a if non-specific factors um, are seen. So its opportunity of cost is zero. In other words, its transfer earning is zero. So it is entirely actual earning in the existing use is in the existing use is rent. So next slide, please. So the determination of rent of land or the scarcity theory of rent. So modern economists have actually argued that rent arises due to the scarcity of land, which is also said in the modern theory of rent. So scarcity of land means that the demand for land exceeds its supply. Therefore, rent will be determined at a point where the demand for land is equal and its supply. So demand for land. So land has derived demand. Of course, we know that. It means that the demand for land depends on the demand for, let's say, agricultural products. So if the demand for food, grains, or vegetables increases, the demand for land will also increase and vice versa. Moreover, the demand for land is actually influenced by its marginal productivity. This means as more and more land is used, its marginal productivity goes on diminishing. Next is the supply of land. This actually, we all know that the supply of land is fixed. We can increase it or decrease it, but its supply is it's perfectly inelastic. This means that an increase in the price of land will not evoke an increase in its supply. And lastly, next slide, please. This is actually an additional theory, which is the bid rent theory. It's actually the easiest to understand, in my opinion. And this theory states that it is actually a geographical economics theory that refers to how the price of demand for real estate changes as the distance from the central business district increases. So it states that the different land users will compete with one another for land closest to the city center. So it actually gives more emphasis on the direct relation between transport costs and land use intensity. Next slide.
Okay. So in this part, Tasha and I will compare and contrast the rental cost of living in NCR versus in nearby provinces and in Tokyo versus in Saitama, Japan. I am going to discuss further about the urban and regional economics in the Philippine context by establishing the high rental cost of living in NCR as against the rental cost of living in nearby provinces, which is in our case, we chose to compare it with Calabarzon. So next slide, please. First, it is crucial to assess the demographic characteristics of households, total population, total households, income, and structure of the family group are regarded as critical elements of determining a renter's choice. So based on the table presented, it is evident that the total population and household of Calabarzon is greater than NCR. However, on the flip side, NCR is higher in terms of average income, minimum wage, and rental price. So next slide, please. So according to PSA, house rent and rent expenditure NCR is 18.2%, which is higher than Calabarzon, measuring 11.6%. So why is that so? So in this table, I have computed the respective average rental price by some of the reliable sources I have found on the internet. First, I relied on this website entitled myproperty.ph. On this website, you have the option to choose what kind of property. It can be an apartment, commercial, condominium, and house. For the location, you are free to type there wherever you want to rent. In this case, I just look for Metro Manila and Calabarzon provinces. So moreover, what I like about this website is that you are free to set the price, and syempre, it depends on your budget and the number of bedrooms, which is based on the family size. Once you're all set up, all the rental property details will be sorted. So aside from this website, I have also looked for more rental properties on Facebook groups. So next slide, please. So going back, house rent or rent expense in NCR is higher than Calabarzon because it is the most populous metropolitan region. And also, the capital of the Philippines is Manila, where it is the center of education, businesses, and transportations. So if we take into account the state of minimum wage and high rent prices, Manila is considered one of the most expensive places to live in Southeast Asia, according to the latest study by the iPrice Group's research. Also, the average Filipino would need 154% of their annual salary to afford 1 year's worth of rent in Metro Manila. So before we tackle the rental cost, first, we must consider that there are several types of rental housing in the country. Rental housing varies by type, size, construction, and ownership. And also, your personal cost of living depends on what kind of lifestyle you want to have and what kind of a job you have. So next slide, please. Okay, so in NCR, depending on the part of the city and type of the rental house, you can find an apartment for at least 5,000. And for a larger one, for the whole family, you will have to pay at least 25,000. But if you are in the upper class and you prefer to rent a condo, the minimum cost for you to acquire it is about 20,000 per month. So in terms of larging living spaces, both indoors and outdoors, venturing out further from Metro Manila is the better option. Calabarzon provinces such as Laguna, Cavite, Batangas, Rizal, and Quezon also feature a greater amount of land that offer more options in terms of affordable rental houses. So the least one you can get is about 2,700 for one bedroom and 11,500 for three bedrooms. But again, it depends on the area, size, and construction. So after comparing the rental costs in NCR and Calabarzon, there's no denying that Calabarzon provinces offer cheaper rental houses than NCR. Now, I am inviting Natasha to discuss the rental cost of living in Tokyo versus in Saitama, Japan.
Thank you, Ashley. Now let's compare Tokyo and Saitama, Japan. First, let's take a look at the demographical data of these respective cities. Tokyo, being Japan's capital, as well as the country's political and economic seat, is known to be the most populous and um, known to be the most populous urban area in the world with a population of more than 14 million with a total household of 7.2 million in 2021. On the other hand, Saitama, a major city with half an hour by train north of Tokyo, is primarily a residential city with a total population of over 1.3 million consisting of 621, 338 households as of 2021. Tokyo's working class receives an annual income of 6.2 million yen or 2.7 million pesos on average, which is significantly higher to those in Saitama averaging only 4.8 million yen or 2.1 million pesos a year. Minimum wage in Japan are set by hourly rates, and each prefecture or district has a different value. As of as Tokyo is the wealthiest city in the country, it also has the highest minimum hourly wage in the country with 1,041 Japanese yen or 465 pesos per hour. Saitama, Tokyo's neighboring city, has a minimum wage of 956 Japanese yen or 428 pesos per hour. Next slide, please. So we have mentioned that Tokyo has high salaries, but it also has an elevated cost of living, and rent tends to make up a large part of it. Some of the world's most expensive land can be found in central Tokyo, which contributes to its reputation as an expensive city. However, rent can vary from cheap tiny apartments to extravagant priced luxury apartments in prime districts based on their type, location, age, size, and amenities. For a prime city, which is Tokyo, the average rent for an apartment costs more than 100,000 Japanese yen or 45,000 pesos per month. While outside of central Tokyo, like Saitama, rent varies from 50,000 to 70,000 Japanese yen, which is more or less 20,000 to 30,000 per month in Philippine peso. Next slide, please. You may be wondering why Tokyo is much more expensive and populated than Saitama. The main factor is urbanization and geographical location. Cities and districts outside central Tokyo, such as Saitama, are considered suburbs and distinctly 50% lower in rental costs compared to residing in the metropolitan area. While Tokyo, being Japan's seat of economic activities, is more urbanized and has close proximity to workplaces and public transportations, which increases Tokyo's demand for housing, thus raising the rental cost of living. Due to this, a significant number of Saitama residents commute to Tokyo to work in order to avoid the high cost of living associated with it. However, looking at the massive difference in population between the two neighboring cities, most opted to move to Tokyo and live with a high pay, high rent kind of lifestyle rather than stay in their respective provinces. So that's all for Japan versus Tokyo's comparison. Next reporter, please.
So for this section, Kay and I will be discussing about the transportation model of Japan and the Philippines, and we will be answering the question, would mass transportation be a good incentive to just rent outside the metropolitan area? Next slide, please. So to begin with, allow us to share the 2020 data of the share of households renting in Japan and the Philippines. Kay, please start with Japan.
So for Japan, in 2020, the share of households renting dwellings and land in Japan stood at about 21.2%. Rental units account for 35.6% of the total number of occupied housing units, and the share of private rental housing has steadily increased. However, these rental units are significantly smaller than owned houses. Scarce land, geography, and recent economic trends have affected Japan's housing market, with scarce land being the most fundamental factor, as only 29% of the country's land is considered habitable. Frequent and significant earthquakes result in national building codes being revised after every major earthquake. This results in old structures being obsolete. Another defining factor is the rapid change in housing stock, demographics, and lifestyle after World War II. After millions of houses burned down during the war, this resulted in a housing shortage, with the ensuing baby boom between 1947 and 1949 exacerbating the housing shortage. During the post-war economic growth period, a large portion of the population also migrated from rural areas to urban areas, especially in the Tokyo metropolitan area.
So for the Philippines, 10.2% of the country's household are renting a house or room, including a lot. Urban area has a higher rental occupation percentage of 18%, while rural area has a record of 19% residents who are renting the house and the lot they occupy. In the urban areas, NCR and Calabarzon have the highest percentage of families occupying rental housing with 31.3% and 19% record respectively. Next slide, please. So for the Philippine transport model, as of 2012, the transport sector plays a key role in the Philippine economy as it bridges the population and economic centers across the country. The transportation system of the said country consists of road, water, air, and rail transport. So for the air transport, 215 airports aid the air transport system of the country, 84 of which are owned and controlled by the government, while the remaining are owned by private sectors. Two of the busiest airports in the Philippines are the Ninoy Aquino International Airport in Manila, which accommodated 435,000 and 486 aircraft movements with an estimated 29.6 million passengers in 2011, and the Mactan International Airport, having 82,554 aircraft movements with approximately 6.3 million passengers in the same year. Because of the growing demand, the government has planned to develop Clark International Airport, or formerly known as Diosdado Macapagal International Airport, to address capacity constraints. Next, for the water transport, it aids the inter-island transportation system of the country. In total, there are 1,300 ports in the Philippines, 1,000 of which are state-owned, while the remaining are privately owned. Out of the 1,000 government-owned ports, 140 are under the governance of the Philippine Ports Authority and Cebu Ports Authority, while the rest are under the control of the government agencies or local government units. In recent years, the government has developed the services of the roll-on, roll-off, or commonly known as RoRo ferries, to provide alternative options for the long-distance inter-island shipping services. With this, port facilities have been refurbished to accommodate the operation of the RoRo ferry services. Next slide, please. So for the urban transport, the rapid growth of the Philippines has sped up its urbanization. Come 2030, approximately 77% of the country's population is expected to reside in the urban areas. As of the 2010 writing, there are 120 cities in the Philippines, 16 of which are in are in Metro Manila, and that is the only metropolitan area of the country. And other major urban clusters can also be found in Davao, Cebu, Iloilo, but those areas have insufficient metropolitan organizations. Transport systems in these areas consist of jeepneys, taxis, tricycles, pedicabs, and other privately owned vehicles. Specifically in Metro Manila, there is a network of roads and railways for the system. Although this can handle high capacities, the volume of traffic in this area is extremely high, causing congestion. And although rural areas have less severe congestion, constant increase in urban population and rates of motorization would imply a worsening case of the traffic congestion in urban areas in the near future. Like the other urban areas, Metro Manila's public roads are mainly provided by private sectors. So for the railway system of the Philippines is divided into three categories: light rail transit or LRT, Metro Rapid Transit or MRT, and those two are both operating in Metro Manila, and the Philippine National Railways or PNR in the southern area of Metro Manila. Two lines of LRT are under a government-owned corporation, Light Rail Transit Authority, while the other one was funded and constructed by Metro Rapid Transit Corporation, a private entity. The lines of LRTA accommodate an average of 579,000 passengers daily, while MRTC carries approximately 400,000 passengers daily. The fare structure of this system is solely based on the distance from their point of origin to their point of destination. Overcrowding is common in these railway lines, especially during peak hours where there is a high influx of commuters. With this, it was said that LRT lines exceed about 60% of their overall load factors. On the other hand, Philippine National Railways or PNR is responsible for a number of heavy railway systems operating towards the south of the metro. In 2011, the PNR had a record of carrying 9.1 million passengers and 15.4 million passengers in 2011. This high increase in number was brought about by the completion of the Caloocan to Alabang line. Also, PNR was able to operate a line linking Manila to Bicol but was suspended due to typhoon damages in 2006. However, PNR, together with the Department of Transportation, is eyeing the partial operability of PNR Bicol and other segments such as San Pablo, Candelaria, Lucena, and Pagbilao in 2022.
So for Japan's transport model, their transport system as of 2017 is modern, secure, punctual, and well organized, as well as outstanding in service, making it a good incentive for people to utilize public transportation instead of private cars. It is considered the best in the world, and almost all Japanese people prefer using public transport than driving their own vehicles. Like in other countries, land, sea, and air transports are present in Japan, but the backbone of their transport is their trains. So, first, their water transport. It is used to connect harbor cities in Japan, as well as to connect small islands with each other through the use of ferries and vessels. There are 22 harbors stipulated as main harbors by the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, and Transportation in Japan. In addition to serving domestic routes, Japan also caters to overseas routes. Some vessels are dedicated for a cluster of domestic routes, and others are for overseas routes. For their air transport, Japan provides comprehensive services for international flights through their two major airlines, Japan Airlines and ANA. Japan has a total of 98 airports, with its main international gates in Osaka and Nagoya, and domestic flights served by the International Airport of Tokyo, which is also the busiest airport in Asia, as well as the fourth busiest in the world. For their land transport, there are various kinds of land transport in Japan, with its pride being the fastest train in existence, the bullet train. Other modes of transportation include the subway, bus, and taxi. Japan also has a total of 3,483 express highways, which is expected to increase by 2,466 kilometers more with the completion of 19 routes being developed connecting Nagoya to Tokyo. For their railway system, this is the main transport in Japan, which connects main cities and is the main commuter transport in big cities such as Tokyo and Osaka. Their first railway was developed in 1872 and connected Tokyo to Yokohama. After about 5 years, almost all cities in Japan had already been connected by railways. So in Japan, this is their main facility for mass transportation, especially in the big cities and metropolitan areas. Their fast trains allow commuters to travel long distances in a relatively short time, with the travel time from Tokyo to Osaka, approximately 500 kilometers, taking 2 hours and 30 minutes via bullet train, which includes transiting through several cities such as Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kyoto. So inter-island transport is also an important part of this train, as these trains can pass through tunnels and bridges. In Tokyo alone, there are 15 lines covering hundreds of kilometers with an additional 5 routes spreading across Tokyo and Osaka covered by their bullet train. So aside from the railway system, the subways are also utilized to connect the 4 biggest islands in Japan. The Tokyo subway, which has been operational since 1927, is known as the widest network of a city subway in the world. In addition to circling the city, its railway connects Tokyo metropolis to the surrounding suburban areas. The Japanese subway train is also known for its punctuality, with their trains arriving in each station every 5 minutes on average. So their other forms of transportation include by taxi or bus, with commuting by taxi the most expensive among other modes of transport, but it is still utilized as it can bring people to specific addresses, especially if it's written in Japanese. Japanese buses also pass through urban areas, and the fares for these are relatively cheaper than commuting by train, with the average bus ticket price at only 200 yen.
So in conclusion, mass transportation would be a good incentive compared to that of rental housing occupation outside the metropolitan area. Assuming that there is a reliable and well-utilized mass transportation system, it offers time and cost-efficient services to the public. Mass transit can efficiently run through dense areas to deliver passengers to their destinations. People would also divert their consumer spending to transportation, unlike renting, wherein they would divide their budget allocation to both rent and transportation expenses, since there is no guarantee that renting in nearby areas would spare them from commuting. So for the advantages, Kay?
So one of the advantages for mass transportation is it reduces household expenses. Being close to public transport links help those who can't drive and make their day-to-day lives more convenient. Tenants are often willing to travel a little further into work if it means that they can live in a quieter part of town, as long as they have access to strong transport links. Households also choose their residents according to their socio-economic characteristics as well as neighborhood characteristics, with the accessibility to specific destinations, such as their workplaces, playing a major role in their decision making. So creating strong transport systems that are accessible and efficient alleviates the need for car ownership as well as the expense of maintaining a vehicle. It also has the added benefit of making more jobs accessible for people, since public transport eliminates the need to own a car to earn a paycheck. This allows households to earn more income.
So second is the economic benefits to communities. According to the American Public Transportation Association or APTA, mass transit also acts as an economic booster, especially when sustained over time. APTA has accounted facts that for one, every $1 investment on public transportation yields to $4 economic returns. Two, every $10 $10 million allocated on capital investment in public transportation leads to a $30 million increase in business sales. And lastly, every 1 billion invested on public transportation supports and generates up to 50,000 jobs. A dependable public transportation links people and businesses. Transit companies and organizations employ workers to aid the transportation system. Other businesses also benefit from public transit system as it allows entry-level jobs and their services to be accessible to where people live.
Third, mass transportation can increase mobility. So public transit can provide basic mobility, especially to those who have limited access to other means of transportation, as I have mentioned earlier. It allows different locations of employment, education, opportunities, leisure, and other community resources to be accessible to each individual or household. Plus, people become less dependent on their companions for rides and have the freedom to reach their destination by opting to use public transport.
Lastly, mass transportation reduces road congestion. One of the main ideas that public transportation promotes is to improve road congestion by reducing the number of vehicles present in a road facility and the time spent on traffic, especially during the peak work hours. Given the increasing urbanization, traffic congestion, particularly in urban areas, will continue to grow and affect an individual's efficient day-to-day commute unless the approach to mobility is changed to save time and increase productivity.
Okay, so for this section, I am going to discuss the programs and other interventions by the Philippine government. So next slide, please. So there are two laws regulating residential and commercial leases in the Philippines. First is the Rental Control Act, and second is the Civil Code. So here are the key difference between the two rental laws. So the Rent Control Act in the Philippines, or Republic Act 9653, better known as the Rent Control Act of 2009, is the law that protects housing tenants, especially in those lower income class, against unreasonable rent increases. It also provides the eviction rules that both landlords and tenants must observe. This rental law in the Philippines covers housing units with a monthly rent of up to 10,000 in Metro Manila and other highly urbanized cities nationwide. Particularly, the following rental properties are covered by the Rent Control Act: apartments, boarding houses, bed spaces, dormitories, rooms for rent, houses, and or land. So landlord and renters who violate any provision of the rental law face penalties: a fine of 25,000 to 50,000, imprisonment of 1 month and 1 day to 6 months, or both. On the other hand, the Civil Code has list provisions that cover rentals above 10,000 and those not covered by the Rent Control Act of 2009, including commercial spaces and rent-to-own units. So the list provisions in the Civil Code are rather lengthy and too technical for common people to understand. If you are covered by this rental law in the Philippines and you think your landlord has violated your tenant rights, it's best to consult a lawyer who specializes in this field. So what are the rights of a tenant in the Philippines? So tenants are entitled to protection as mandated by the rental law in the Philippines. So based on the data from a Philippine Statistical Research and Training Institute, the major or 97% of renters in the country are paying monthly rent at 10,000 and below. Thus, we will focus on the tenant rights provisions under the Rent Control Act. So here are the basic rights you should know if you're renting a home. First, limit on rent increases. Landlords cannot increase the rent by more than what the law allows. The Housing and Urban Development Coordinating Council, a government agency that regulates residential leases in the Philippines, has set the rental increase limits based on the Rent Control Act. Also, this act allows landlords to increase rents only once a year for bed spaces, boarding houses, dorms, and rooms leased to students. In this case, no rent increase can be charged twice or more per year, even if a new tenant move into the house unit within the same year. Second, no charging of excessive deposit and advance rent. Under the Rent Control Act, landlords can only collect not more than a 2-month deposit and not more than 1 month advance rent. However, landlords can use the deposit and advance rent to compensate for losses they incur when tenants fail to pay the rent, settle utility bills, and or cause damage to any part of the property. Lastly, no eviction without legal ground. If your landlord tells you to vacate the house, ask for the specific reason for the eviction. You cannot be evicted for unjust reasons. Next slide, please.
So now we will be talking about the COVID-19 situations or the COVID-19 rental relief intervention by the Philippine government. Next slide, please. So based on the Philippine Statistics Authority, the 2015 census, some 2.7 million households occupy rented housing. So the number is estimated to have increased to about 3.1 million in 2020. So you could have imagined that the COVID-19 pandemic affected millions of households, which is why the government implemented the Rent Relief Act of 2020. Next slide, please. So what is the Rent Relief Act of 2020? First, it aims to protect families with newly unemployed members that cause them to miss rental and mortgage payments. So it is actually a measure that proposes to assist tenancy-bound households has been introduced in the Congress by Representative Joey Sarte Salceda. So he has sponsored House Bill number 7665, which actually allows nearly 2 million people to refinance their rent. So the law actually includes a 3-month eviction moratorium to allow renters and landlords to renegotiate rental agreements. So also, this bill actually authorizes accepting promissory notes if the renters receive financial aid from the government, and the rent obligation will be transferred into a loan to avoid eviction. This is also actually a act to help renters and lessors, as I've said, renegotiate lease terms and find other assistance programs from the Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development has set up the rental assistance centers. And lastly, the Bayanihan to Recover as One Act or the Bayanihan 2 actually also requires commercial lessors to comply with a 30-day grace period. Next slide, please. So now we will be presenting the policy prescriptions of our group. So just a preface, we are, of course, economic students, and we just base our policy prescriptions from the research or things we've read from the internet and other resources. Go ahead, Carmel.
So next slide, please. First is the removal of rent control. Less stringent rent control schemes do not remove the unintended consequences of rent control. The picture that emerges in the case of Metro Manila in 2014 is that the benefits of rent control are not captured by the poor and low-income households. In some cases, the transfers could be negative, services are substandard, and tenants are paying more than what they could have paid and better housing facilities. This basically gives the lessors no incentive to upgrade. Moreover, the policy bias toward home ownership, including maximum tolerance on informal settlements, has resulted in the development of rental markets in slums and or poor neighborhoods in order to meet the increasing demand for affordable rental housing in the city. In the case of the landlords, albeit in the Philippine government has relaxed the rent control law through vacancy decontrol and partial coverage, the law constraints our lessor's conversion of property. Also, the uncertainty of the future regulatory environment on rent control, for example, raising rent ceiling, will also lead to the postponement in rental investments.
So, since we are actually advocating for the removal of the rent control, what do we want? We actually want to what do you call that? To implement rent assistance or housing assistance. So we believe that the issue is the lack of affordable and decent rental housing in the market. So the Rent Control Act is we believe it is not the appropriate policy to address the problem of housing the poor and marginalized households, nor of encouraging investments, of course, in affordable rental housing. So a better alternative could be the provision of rental assistance or housing allowance. So compared to rent control, rental assistance actually reduces the problem of affordability by providing the marginalized households or others who need housing support a choice to live in a better environment rather than what do you call that? Uh rather than being locked in poor neighborhoods. So rental assistance actually also promotes investments in rental housing and can discourage the developments of the market in slums since the program can be confined in, shall we say, rental housing units in lands with formal or legal rights. So the subsidy to a rental assistance program can be supported by the improvements in the property tax base. So in adopting the rental assistance, this would mean that the government or the government policy should shift away from the public provision of housing, which is actually a lot costlier and less efficient than direct income transfers. So it would also mean a review of the rationale for expanding financing support to informal settlers by which is actually intended to encourage professional squatting. So public rental housing administered by the local government can also be considered as actually an alternative program, but this would require LGUs to institutionalize the program by allocating funds for development and real estate management, which actually needs to be studied further if we actually want to implement public rental housing. So rent control has been enacted to address um, issues of the security of tenure. So security of tenure in rental housing, aside from the affordability issues, is actually an important societal objective. So there are views that tenants have no rights against evictions that may arise from the uncertainty of future rent prices. And lessors actually have possible the possible conversion of property by lessors is actually used to it will be a little bit less profitable if we continue continue in implementing the rent control act. So this argument is valid, but the we could say that the unintended consequences of the rent control act could outweigh the possible improvement in the security of tenure arising from the stricter laws on conversion and rent increase. So moreover, the security of tenure could be addressed through other ways. For example, lease agreements. So this actually doesn't create distortions on the housing market. Go ahead, Tasha.
So next, what can we expect when rent control is lifted? First, the lifting of rent control will not result in excessive rent increases. The fear of prices increasing if there is no rent control is unfounded. The supply of rental markets target specific clientele, increasing rents beyond what their target market can absorb, which puts their rental businesses out of the market. Moreover, in recent years, real estate developers have been very aggressive in the development of affordable condominiums for ownership, partnering with banks and with the Home Development and Mortgage Fund for low interest rates and low monthly amortizations. The developers also offer rent-to-own schemes at rates close to the controlled market, but of better housing quality. Second, the lifting of rent control will remove the uncertainty caused by frequent extensions of the rent control law. Uncertainty discourages investment in the sector since rules are bound to change whenever the law is extended. Lifting rent control and giving incentives to property owners will encourage more investments in affordable rental housing and increase competition in the market. Lastly, the end of the rent control law is unlikely to result in increased eviction. It is observed that most rental houses in Metro Manila that are covered by rent control are owned by small property owners, meaning single homes, townhouses, in existing residential areas, and etc. And some are constructed within the family lot or extensions of owners' houses. Most property owners in the rental housing business are small scale and engage in the business to augment their income or to utilize idle land or property. These owners are unlikely to evict tenants on the basis of a potential conversion of the property for commercial use. Moreover, cases of eviction in rental homes are mostly due to non-payment of rent rather than undue reasons. Non-payment of rent is also the reason often cited by landlords for them to evict tenants. Next slide, please.
Okay. So in summary, living in Metro Manila provides more opportunities for working Filipinos. Manila, as the capital of the Philippines, is the center of businesses, transportations, and other economic activities. Considering NCR's minimum wage, it is higher compared to those areas outside the metropolitan region. That's why many people choose to live or work in NCR for a sustainable living.
Yes, that's right. Therefore, the government should strengthen programs that would create better opportunities for the Filipino people, especially those who live outside the metropolitan region. They must increase employment potential or business ventures that are accessible to all.
In addition, challenges are very much common in the transportation system of the Philippines. Despite the high rates, many still opt to rent because of the poor transportation system of the country. People tend to search for an apartment or housing in a strategic area that would grant them access to the metro and save them time and from the hassle of commuting.
An efficient and modern transport system can also help provide opportunities for those who work outside the metro, giving them the advantage of working in an urban area while also widening their prospects for housing in terms of rent. Being able to travel long distances in a short amount of time can increase employment in the metro and provide better access to education, health, and other services in rural settings.
And lastly, we believe that the main issue here is the lack of affordable and decent rental housing in the market. So therefore, we believe that the rent control law is not the appropriate policy to address the problem of housing the poor and marginalized households, nor of encouraging investments in affordable rental housing. So a better alternative that we propose is the provision of rental assistance or housing allowance, which actually addresses the problem of affordability in renting houses. That's all. Next slide. Next slide. So that is all, and thank you for listening to our presentation. Thank you. Say thank you, guys.
Thank
Thank
you.
You.
you. Bye bye.